Well, thank you very much indeed for having me along. I feel like a complete interloper. You can see that I'm a barrister specialising in mental capacity, mental health, disability rights. I'm also a visiting professor at King's College London. This feels like Monty Python. This is like, and now for something completely different. This has absolutely, at one level, nothing to do with what we've been just talking about, really. I've been so interested in what we've been talking about so far. I'm moving to something rather different, which is about sexual expression in the context of people with cognitive impairments. So a couple of caveats. This is in large part going to talk about a case in the Supreme Court from a couple of years ago, which I was involved in. I'm not doing it because I was involved in it. It's because it was in a case which brought up the important issue, but I need to make clear I am not talking on behalf of my client, who was the local authority in that case. I also just want to thank Allegra Ennifer, who gave some really helpful research advice here, research assistance here, and Alan Duncan, who's at the University of Limerick, and the three of us co-wrote the draft chapter, which I think some of you got. So for those of you who didn't get the chance to read it, and I entirely understand if you didn't, let's just do a quick recap of this case. So this is the first case which gets to the Supreme Court in England and Wales, obviously Supreme Court of the UK, but it's irrelevant purposes, England and Wales, about what capacity means, mental capacity means. And of course, we're English, so the first case which gets there is about sex. It's just, it couldn't be more English. In a way, actually, it's really, really bad. This was the first case to get to the Supreme Court about, because it meant, on the concept of capacity, because it meant people were grappling with it against a backdrop of all sorts of edginess and taboo and twitch. It would have been much nicer if it had got there on in a different context, but it didn't. So the critical thing about this case is it involves a situation where we have a man who has cognitive impairments, and the evidence before the court, which was not fully tested and no full determination had been made, could not understand that a prospective sexual partner had to consent. So he just couldn't process that fact. He was also living a life, because many people with cognitive impairments lead lives controlled by others. He was living a life where he was in a supported living placement, and his only actual ability to, as it were, meet women, he was heterosexual, was at, I think the actual words we used were disco, which betrays something, with young women with learning disabilities. So the Venn diagram of people he was likely to have sex with, and he was just, on the face of it, determined to have sex with, and he just wanted sex. He wasn't interested in a relationship, he just wanted sex. So the Venn diagram of likely sexual partners and people who may well not be able to give consent was quite high. In fact, and I really, really wish the Supreme Court had just said, why are we here? Because there was an agreement all the way through. He didn't have capacity to make decisions about contact, and he had 2-to-1 supervision. So he was never in a situation where he was going to have unsupervised contact with a woman. So actually, this is an entirely pointless case, because he was never going to have sex, so why were we bothering? However, the official solicitor acting on his behalf and litigation friend was very, very cross at the finding. She agreed he didn't have capacity to make decisions about contact, and she agreed this care plan. But she was very cross at the conclusion reached that he didn't have capacity. In first instance, it was to consent to sexual relations. When it gets to the Court of Appeal says, it's a bit weird to talk about capacity to consent here, because this suggests he is the passive recipient of other people's enthusiasms. This is not a man who other people are going to be approaching. This is a man who is going to be approaching other people. So why are we talking about capacity to consent? We should be talking about capacity to decide to engage in sexual relations. And then the question was, is it legally necessary? Is it interesting as a matter of law that he apparently cannot understand or use and weigh the fact that other people need to consent? Because if it is, then as a matter of law, he doesn't have capacity to make that decision, because the Mental Capacity Act requires you to be able to understand, retain, use and weigh relevant information. So what's really interesting about, many things are interesting about this case to me, but one of them is it totally gets the fact that the idea of capacity is at one level socially constructed. Because before the Supreme Court, one of the questions was, well, should everybody be able to understand that their prospective sexual partner is consenting? And the official solicitor was saying, no, That isn't part of it. That's not part of the test. He can understand what sex is. The question of whether he has non-consensual sexual relations should be picked up by the criminal law after the event. I have to say, when the barrister for the official solicitor said that, the Supreme Court, 5 judges, 2 females, 2 women, the 2 women more or less left across the desk at that point, because in effect, what he was saying was consent doesn't have to mean consent. So there was a full-on punch-up. And so they said, of course, it's not it's not holding individuals with cognitive impairments to a higher standard to say that they need to be able to understand that the prospective sexual partner is actually consenting. That's what we expect everyone to. So that really shows the kind of social construction of what we say the relevant information is. And then we run into a really big clash of principles, which is, to me, what the interesting thing is, and I just want to bring before you, and I just be fascinated, this really expert group of people, your take on this. Because on the one hand, we've got this idea it's really important to support people with cognitive impairments to express themselves sexually. This is not saying there's a right to sex. I mean, people might say that, but that's not necessarily an integral part of this. And on the other hand, we've got, on the face of it, a societal duty to protect people who cannot consent. And it's how you square those two, especially given we have a known person and a known pool of possible victims. So should the courts be intervening, should the local authority be intervening to stop this man having sex with people who may well not be able to consent? So I think there's a pretty full-on punch-up principles-wise. I can't actually see a way out of it. And the paper, the chapter tries to look at it from a European Convention perspective, and then it tries to look at it through the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Neither of them, I think, really do anything other than just reframe and say there's a problem here. And I just wanted then, before I kind of throw the floor open to discussion, it's really interesting. I did history at Oxford many years ago, and so this entire place is very confusing because it's completely changed since I was here. This place didn't exist. I mean, this was a hospital, so this whole place. But as a historian, I think it's always interesting to go back and look at history. And a lot of this was being thought about in the late 1990s when people were moving towards thinking about we need a new piece of legislation relating to sexual offences. And the Law Commission looked at this. They were asked to look at it because they'd just done a piece of work on the idea of what does mental capacity look like. They were asked to look at it. Well, how does it work in the context of sex and people with cognitive impairments? And they said the criminal law is really challenging and problematic, where you've got somebody with cognitive impairments who might be an active participant. And it's particularly challenging when you've got 2 people with learning disabilities, say. Like, how do you think it through? You know, what do we do? And they said, actually, what we need is a grown-up discussion and a consultation about whether we just say the criminal law should work differently here. And unsurprisingly, the government of the day didn't engage in grown-up public consultation. It just had, we will make it slightly less difficult than it then was for individuals with cognitive impairments to be seen to be able to consent, but had nothing to say about this sort of situation. The second thing I find fascinating as a historian is there was no necessary reason that we started talking about sex in the civil law context at all. The only reason that we started getting terribly excited in endless cases being about capacity to consent to sex or now to decide on sex is that Sir James Mumby, one of the big beasts in every single way in family law, in a case which had nothing to do with sex per se, which is all to do with did someone have the ability to consent to marriage? Again, I think it's really interesting we talk about consent to marriage as opposed to decision to engage in marriage. Said, well, of course, it's self-evident that to marry, you have to have the ability to make decisions about sex. I mean, maybe true, but it's really interesting. The case had nothing to do with it. And because he started talking about it, you then see everyone says, well, he said it, we need to start having it. And we have endless cases and people running around trying to analyze, does this person have ability to make decisions about sex in the complete abstract, and then going, with no idea what to do with this information. So it's really interesting. If you look back, this just didn't need to happen, and it's happened. And now we've got the law is firmly embedded in people's bedrooms, which is really, at one level good, because if people are having sex in circumstances where they can't consent, they, on the face of it, harms might be being caused. on the face of it. But I mean, it's very interesting. If you have two adults with dementia, two people with learning disability, what sort of harm are we bothered about? I mean, obviously, you may have issues where somebody may not have the ability to make decisions about contraception, but assume contraception is provided for, assuming no one's got STDs. You know, and the law is now going, you really got to think about this. And a lot of actual harm is caused in care in settings, but by people just going, we don't know what to do, so we've got to stop. So I think two really kind of boring things to think about, but I'm much more interested in your observations. One of them is, it's amazing how individuals with cognitive impairments, everyone is just terrified about thinking about them as sexual beings. There's just, for God's sake, let's pretend. So let's not have sex education. Let's not do anything. Let's have nothing. And let's just sort of hope that they don't have sex, which is, I mean, A, really challenging just as a matter of principle, and B, just pragmatically really difficult. Because then you have situations where actually, if you'd had, for instance, JB, I think on the face of the evidence, his cognitive impairments are probably such that it would be difficult for him ever to achieve this understanding. But if you'd had him, I mean, he's 37, but if you had him throughout his life, or, you know, in the mainstream of special educational needs, there should be part of it being, how do you think about sex? How can you understand all this business? We might have a cohort of people who are actually seen to be able to make decisions. Also, just basic sex ed about consent came up in the Supreme Court, and you realise quite how rubbish it is and how no one really understands it at all. But there could be some work there, but especially on the basis of just because this person's got a cognitive impairment, please don't be squeamish. And the second is, I'm a lawyer who really is bothered about how the law has got itself intruded in a whole range of places by asking questions at one level we just shouldn't have asked. And I think there's some really challenging issues about the extent to which we've started asking questions here without really thinking about why we're asking about them. And so one way of the law can't just back away. I mean, you can't, at one level, the law's there, and there might be situations where it's clearly doing the right thing, though it's not obvious it's always doing that. One way of thinking about it is, as I say, what I really wish the Supreme Court had done in JB, say, could we not have an academic, that's not being rude, but have an academic discussion about JB's ability to make decisions about sex in the abstract? He's not going to have sex. Why do we need to have this discussion? So it's only ever relevant if there's actually a real person or a real class of people where this person might pose a risk in some way, and then we can at least have a concrete discussion. So, as I said, this is complete Monty Python, completely different. But anyway, those are the things at the top, and that's just some follow-up stuff. The top link there is a paper I wrote, largely based on stuff, or Allegra and I co-wrote, largely based on stuff which the Supreme Court didn't address in the JB case about the complexity of the criminal law approach to people with cognitive impairments and sex. And then that's the chapter that you've got. And that's me.